Hello, everybody. Welcome to Food and Culture. This is Folklore 2407. I'm Ian, and I am your professor this semester. And we're going to be doing this, of course, because COVID. We'll be doing this online. I hope you are well. I hope you are healthy. I hope you are financially okay, and I hope the people that you care for and your communities are likewise. I don't think anyone wants to be doing it this way, but as we're doing it this way, why don't we try and make the most of it? So soon, if we're all good people, we all do our best and all do our part, we can be together with our loved ones and hug them and get the hugs that we also deserve. So this is a course in food and culture. And I guess the first question is, why should we study food and culture to begin with? And I mean, it's food is a basic to our existence. I mean, it is a requirement. We are animals. We are creatures, and we require the energy and the sustenance that we get from food. So obviously we have that as like a basic biological necessity, but we also have once we have gone past that idea of food as mere biology, we can express it in a number of different ways. That we eat is relevant, or at least axiomatic. But what we eat, when we eat, who we eat with, on what occasions do we eat particular things, how do we use what we eat to express something about ourselves, something about our communities, something about the historical moment. All of that are socially constructed, and all of those are basically examples of food of folklore. The other thing about food is that it's experienced with the senses. I mean, it's not like a text that you sort of read and intuit. It is not like a song that, I mean, you can sort of feel a song. Obviously, you listen to it and you sort of can get caught up in the sensory experience of a musical performance. But I mean, all our senses are used. Our sight, our touch, our taste, clearly, smell, even the sound of food, the sound of either crunching vegetables under a knife, or the sound of sizzling steaks, or even the sounds that we make while we're eating. Not simply chewing sounds, but the yum yum sounds. There is something about food that is universally experienced and immersive, and we don't understand it, really, unless we are actually engaged in it. It is that much of a sensory experience. We don't have a language for food nearly as well as we have a language for visual things. It's difficult to sort of communicate food. We can't share food in the same way that we can share a view thanks to a camera. We can only share food by sharing food. Maybe we can share ingredients and have you make it at home. Maybe we can share recipes. But really, the only way to understand it is to immerse yourself in it. And food is also a personal thing. It's open to interpretation. You don't need to interpret food. Food can just be eaten. It is unlike a text. I mean, a text is clearly a matter of interpretation. Language is clearly a matter of interpretation. Food is something that you consume. But it is open to interpretation. It's open to these symbolic acts, or this interpretation as food as a symbolic act. One of the things I like to think of as a great insight, or a great way of thinking about food, is to think about the sandwich. Because the sandwich is a really good illustration of the dynamics of folklore. A sandwich is very much like dance in some ways. It's personal. It's often localized. It tends to reflect sort of the idiosyncratic tastes of the group and particular aesthetic expectations. In its very common forms, instructions for how to do it are very simple. put it together, make steps. And it's communicated not through formal means, but rather informal means. It's learned much more by apprenticeship than it is by following a strict regimen, as it were. And once you understand the basic ideas of a sandwich, you can introduce variation. You can understand sandwiches, and then you can do more with it. It's also very democratic. Unlike certain forms of food, a sandwich is open. Anyone can basically make a sandwich. It is, that being said, like much folklore, you can recognize people who are better at making it than others. Like maybe your mom's PB&J is the best that there is. It can be adapted, and popular establishments can commodify it, can standardize it, can turn it into something that is made under regimented circumstances. So you have something like McDonald's, which takes a sandwich like the burger and makes it so that every one is identical to every other one. But that said, even when it is in popular culture, it has this sort of aura of authenticity to it, and humble and simple. Again, very much like folklore. And so the question is, well, what is folklore then? So folklore is, and this is what I have to give at the beginning of all my intro things, because you might not have necessarily taken a folklore course. Folklore can have that sort of connotation of old-timey stuff and pieces of music and pieces of story, but certainly the contemporary study of folklore still contains those, has that not necessarily as its center, but we like those things still in large part because we're nostalgic for the origins of our discipline. But folklore is more than simply the study of the old and the quaint and the old-fashioned. It is the study of these processes in some kind of dynamic form. It's the study of informal culture, things that are passed down. So it's not the things that we're interested in per se, but the things are the content of what is passed down. But rather it is the passing down. So not simply why we make a particular food, or we would look at a recipe, for example, in Foodways. Foodways is sort of the generic term for the study of food and the apparatus around it, the meal, the food storage, traditional interpretations of food. So we'd be interested not simply in the old recipe, although the recipe is key, but when it was used, why it was used, how it was adapted, how people introduce new aesthetic properties to it, how people change it because circumstances change. Either new ingredients become available, or old ingredients are no longer available, or the ethos changes. And we don't eat that way anymore, whether the ethos has to do with health. We don't cook with lard anymore, or whether it has to do with sort of a new value system. We don't eat baby birds and puffins anymore. Hunting takes on sort of a different manifestation. Or they become illegal. Certain forms are, that is a protected species, so we don't eat that anymore. And I'm using all these sort of weird biological examples, but how food becomes adapted, because we are interested in the passing on. We're interested in why people are continue to be interested in these foods, continue to be take this thing that is in their past and reproduce it, make it, recreate it. Every meal is fundamentally it's a new performance, and folklorists use performance as sort of like their core elements to it. The core explanation of what folklorists do is the idea of performance. That is something that is brought together and under particular circumstances, and perhaps from a very fluid and a very malleable repertoire. Something is instanced at one particular time, at one particular place, often in conjunction with other people, and to meet their sets of expectations. So we can think of it as story, we can think of it as song, we can think of it as material culture, and we can certainly think of it as food, that often we are cooking for other people, but food is an interesting example of cooking of performing for the self as well, which I'll get to in a second. So all that is brought, all our knowledge is brought back to this particular instance. And so when folklorist checks a recipe or is interested in a particular dish, it's not simply in the dish itself as some kind of artifact of the past, but that flow of continuity, that why it has been considered important all this time, enough for it to enter into the process of tradition. Tradition is, there's so many definitions for it, and you can argue whether tradition as a context actually exists, but at the very least, you can make an argument that tradition is the repetition of instances based in part on the idea that those who repeat those instances find it valuable to repeat those instances. That's a terrible working definition, but actually I think there's a lot there, and I might listen to this afterwards and explore that a little bit more. So yes, performance is our basic issue. Within a group, at a particular place and time, a thing is produced at the intersection of the collective expectations for that thing and the individual maker's experience at making that thing. So things only exist for the moment of its performance, really. What I'm making now, I make this regularly, make it very regularly. It's sort of my standard go-to meal. And I base it on a whole bunch of different expectations. What I'm hoping for, what I like, what sort of gives me some kind of aesthetic pleasure, what gives me sort of cultural pleasure because of the spices that I use. Nutrition aspects, I have it sort of measured out so that I know the kind of calories that I'm getting when I eat it, and in order to help me sort of maintain weight. A whole bunch of things. And so even though I can, this particular instance might fade from memory, and I'll only really remember the fact that it is part of a chain, so it must have existed at one point, or ones like this must have existed. The food only exists, this meal will only exist at this particular moment in time. And so folklorists are interested in at this particular moment in time, how does this thing come to be? So folklorists are interested in, and this is a list that I'm taken from Elliot O-Ring's Introduction to Folk Group and Folklore Genres Reader, but it's an interesting list. So they're interested in the communal, which is, clearly relating to a group. They're interested in the common, i.e. something that's sort of everyday. They are interested in the informal, so nothing that is necessarily standardized or institutionalized. They're often interested in the marginal, things that are expressly, and sometimes particularly of people who have been historically devoid of privilege and at the margins of the community, but also marginal in terms of not necessarily with a huge amount of focus for the individual at any given moment. They're interested in the personal, something that is at least thought to be meaningful by the participants and done in kind of face-to-face. We often will talk about folklore as existing in oral cultures exclusively, but at the very least we're talking about the informal face-to-face modes of getting together. It's interpersonal more than anything. It is to you and I. There's something about the traditional, again, all caveats about that, but the idea that there's some stability over time and that what went before was at least worthy of revisiting and reconsidering. There's aesthetics that there has to be. There's something about not simply that it's about the senses, that it could be done in a number of ways, but it is done in this particular way because it pleases us. I mean, it pleases us, and again, through food, clearly, through taste, through appearance. It is experienced not necessarily purely through the act of intuition. And often it's ideological, that it has some statement in belief, some belief practices. And sandwiches, or, I'll go back to our sandwich example. Sandwiches can illustrate all of that to a certain extent. They're communal. No one really owns the definition of a sandwich. I mean, clearly, again, commercial establishments might maintain something and try to introduce something unique and distinct and copyrightable. But the concept of sandwich is owned by no one. They're common. You find them everywhere. Their simplicity is a key. And again, I'm being very North American centric, but the sandwich is a fairly basic idea. They're informal. At least they seem to be conspicuously absent from most formal times. I mean, it really depends on what you think about, like church suppers and or church teas and funerals and so on, where a sandwich plate is often in the case. Maybe they're marginal, but certainly they are often, outside of larger discourses in the same way that they are kind of informal. They are personal. We have our own versions of them. And if I'm making you a sandwich, it seems to indicate some kind of relationship. And that might seem a strange thing to say. They're traditional. They're often reminders of a past. And just think about things like the sandwiches of our childhood, sandwiches of our youth, sandwiches that our parents made us, and how we sometimes reproduce those tastes. They are clearly aesthetic because about taste, they need to be pleasing, but also the appearance of things, how the shape of a cookie, the presentation of a plate, the laying of a table, again, because we're thinking about food and food ways. But in sandwiches, I mean, what angle do you slice your sandwich if you take the sandwich and cut it in two? Do you do triangles? Do you do rectangles? Do you do mini triangles? Do you put a little toothpick on the top with a little olive sticking out of it? What do you do with a sandwich? And they can be ideological too. I mean, you might need to introduce something like a variation. You might say, "This is my vegan version of of this sandwich classic. This might be my halal version of a sandwich classic," and so on. So, I mean, they still need to conform to some kind of belief system because we operate within belief systems. Another thing to think about in terms of food is how much it relates to place, because before mass transportation made, for the most part, most foods available to most of us most of the year around, food was very localized, and it had to do with, and seasonal, of course. So not simply place, but time. But I'll get to time in a second. So we can think about sometimes when we think about traditional foods, we're thinking particularly the foods that can and only could have been grown in that particular region for the indigenous, small I, indigenous population, the local population, what they would have. So we sometimes think of it as sort of a pre-trade issue. Now, of course, we have always been trading in just using the Cape Breton example. Nova Scotians have been part of a trade. Nova Scotia has always engaged in trade. It's clear from the archaeological evidence that the Mi'kmaq engaged in trade across at least eastern North America, perhaps even further, and the trading of foodstuffs and the trading of seeds and sort of the cultivation that way. So even if the food was grown locally, it was a coming out of a process of trade for non-local species being introduced into the local. And then we had the more formalized systems of trade through the settlers and colonial powers that the colonists were always part of a trade triangle. They might not have been massive centers of trade, so they might not have had all the tastes of the world, but certainly a large amount. How else would tea and sugar be so prevalent in the Cape Breton diet, and molasses? Because none of that grows around here. But we were always part of systems of trade. So we do want to be careful when we think about purely the sort of the locality, because that's already romanticization. We should always think about the fact that the folk are always modern to their times. Excuse me. But then going back to the issue of time and season, before canning, canning's been a practice for so very long, but before certain forms of refrigeration, for certain forms, and again through trade that allows for us to take advantage of the growing seasons of other countries in order for food to arrive here fresh. Food was so often about season, and so like when we would have the fresh foods, when the big feasts having to do with foods that are just coming to bear, literally the fruits of agricultural labor, or the fishing season, or hunting season, or all these seasons that are sort of critical moments. They're related to time. They're related to seasonality, and then time that is not simply agricultural time, or piscicultural time, or horticultural time, but the ideological times in terms of high holidays and so on. We will associate particular foods with that. So there's always this sort of this time aspect of it. And again, preservation has been an issue. We have been preserving food for millennia, whether that is through salting, whether that's through canning, whether that is through making pies, and or whether that is simply burying things in the ground in larder pantry forms. And then eventually, of course, preservation and through mechanical means like refrigeration. Preserving foods is its own thing. And so those techniques, because they are vital techniques, those techniques are passed down and also form part of the foodways tradition. And then ultimately, again, so we're talking about seasonality, is belief. Because what we eat and what we don't eat has a lot to do with implicit or explicit belief systems. What we do with, what constitutes a food, what constitutes an animal that you would eat, and what constitutes an animal that you would not eat. And, once you get past the very basic idea of you can't eat rocks aren't food. Yes, but then you want to think of things like squirrel, where squirrel is as legitimate a meat as anything else. But often people would balk at the idea of squirrel. Of course, some people balk at the idea of meat at all. And meat is fundamentally is not a food. So while it is biologically edible, it is ideologically not, and so that's simply what we bring into our bodies and take out of our bodies. Then there's also the bringing in and taking out it all. Fasting as a form of ritual purification or some kind of performance of piety. That's a consideration. Who we eat with, who we do not eat with. Is it sometimes unclean to bring certain people to our tables? We might not think that in the 21st century, but of course entire systems of religious ritual will sometimes imply insider and outsider. Who we break bread with. Because eating is a personal act. Eating is a social act. Eating is something that we don't do with everybody. And again, what tied into this issue of belief is the idea that we are embodied beings. And so whether or not we are talking about the ethos of what foods to eat and not to eat, whether it's a belief system that is brought forward from a religious belief system, or like an ethical belief system that isn't necessarily tied into a mythic narrative like Christianity or Islam, but is tied into a worldview, an ethos of something else. We also have what you eat, what you don't eat, based on ideas of health, where health is again largely a social construct, often backed up by whatever the science at the time happens to be. But we won't eat, we will or won't eat based on what is not ethically healthy or morally healthy, but what we understand as being physically healthy. So what constitutes gluttony? What constitutes the body? What constitutes being too thin, being too fat? All these things are part of a foodways system. And again, we're not talking about absolutes. We're not defining what constitutes health in this class, but clearly food systems have to do with what that group will understand as healthy or not, clean and unclean. And then there's the sharing of food, like I just talked about. The idea that food is interrelated so closely with hospitality, in large part because it's a finite resource. To share food is to indicate something about your relationship with this person. I invite you into my home. We break bread together. We eat. We drink. We are bonded in this way through food, through this experience of sharing a meal. It's why food is important in courtship. It's why food is important at even sort of banal things or terrible things like faculty meetings. It's like, oh, but we brought food. And it's sort of, the people that you eat with, there's only so much animus that you can carry. So to share food is to be hospitable. To deny food is to indicate something about your relationship with them. And so, and finally, it is all tied up with this idea of tradition. Because cooking is a developed skill, it's passed down from generation to generation. I mean, there is a process that's involved and it's passed down. But just as importantly, these recipes are passed down because they're related to memory and they're related to taste. So we're going to be, this course, we're going to be talking about food and tradition in a whole host of different ways, and maybe ways that you're not necessarily used to. So those are some basic concepts. I want to talk about the course itself. Everything is done through Moodle. All the readings are there, and all the readings are currently there. They're divided up into these nice little sections, and the sections are thematically linked. Once we get past a couple more introductory things, we're going to be talking about sort of issues of domesticity. We're going to be talking about issues of gender. We're going to be talking about, we're going to read all of Diane Tye's Baking as biography. And so that sort of forms its own special section because it's just a wonderful book. And it touches on almost all the themes of the course. We should be reading monographs more. We're going to be talking about otherness and tourism, and we're going to be talking about local identity, collective regional identities through food. All of this will sort of make sense as we go along. At the end of each section, there is a question, and it's one of the main assignments. We have these section reflections, and they are just, how do I describe it? It has a reflective question, answer them in a short essay, like a blog post length. I say about 250 words, using your own experiences and the ideas from the readings. You're not expected to do additional research. You're expected to sort of indicate that you have done the readings in them. So that's sort of one of the criteria. And once you answer that question, the next section's videos and the next section will open up. And that's a way to sort of progress you through the course. Because one of the things that's important to me in teaching during COVID is to provide as much sort of flexibility as possible, and doing it outside of the classroom actually allows for this. So who knows what's going to happen? If you are going to be unexpectedly sick, if you need to unexpectedly travel, and all the other forms of unexpectedness that's going to happen, I wanted to give people the ability to just chill for a couple of weeks. Maybe they just can't maintain the schedule of assignments. And there's a fair amount of assignments. I mean, these weekly things, these section things are every couple of weeks. The ability that you can get behind and you won't be penalized for it. Because everything is, why not? I mean, why don't you set basically your own pace as you go through the course? So that's what I've done. There's no such thing as a late assignment. You do these things, they open up. And then you progress. So you need to catch up eventually, but and all the assignments will be sort of nice and clearly knowable as you go through. So, yeah. I explained this in the syllabus a bit in a bit more detail, but basically, I want you to go at more or less your own pace. That said, there are dates that are associated with these things, and that is not contradicting what I'm just saying, but it's a good anchor for you if you want to sort of see where you should be. It's like, well, if it's February 22nd, I'm just back from reading week, and we're just going to be, the rest of the class is starting Baking his Biography. And so that's where I should be. And so I'll just anchor you. So don't worry about the due dates, but just know that they are present. We have 2 additional assignments in addition to the short reflections. The short reflections are worth, I have them at 6 marks each. And then there's 6 of them, and the lowest one is dropped. My beans are ready. My beans are ready. There we go. So we have 2 basic assignments. One is, I call it the fieldwork assignment, and that's a little bit of a big name for it. But basically, I want you to participate in some kind of food event. And a food event is a performance. It is the basic idea. Anything that has to do with food. It is not a big occasion. Some people think there's no food event between now and when this assignment is due because they're thinking something massive. But you have probably 2 to 5 food events a day. You have some instance where food is used. You eat, presumably. You might not eat much, but you eat something, or you see someone else eat. You might go to a restaurant between now and then. You might have a meal with your family or your friends. You might try out a new recipe. Something might happen. But sometime between now and reading week, you're going to be eating some food. So do that. And document it. Figure out what's going on and really sort of interrogate that moment. What am I eating? Why am I eating this? Or, third party it. Like I'm going to hang out with my friends. I'm going to watch them make something. And you could ask them questions. Where did you learn how to do this? Why are you eating this? What's that about? And just sort of have fun with it. But think about, it's an opportunity to think about food. For this assignment, there'll be a special video that's made as well, and you watch it, and then if you sort of need to sort of sign off on it, basically saying, okay, I got it, I'm good, or I need to ask you a couple of questions, I'm going to send you an email, or I'm completely lost, I need to set up an appointment to talk to you. All those options are available to you, and voila. So you sign off, you'll get the better instructions, the more detailed instructions, and then we're off. I will, and then you can hand it in. And again, due dates, scare quotes, around reading week, either just before or just after reading week, but about that time. We have an end of semester assignment. It is going to be very similar in terms of, it's going to be similar in that there's also going to be a detailed instruction video on what I'm expecting, when things are, whether you need help or not, or whether you need additional information. You click, and then that's open to you, and that's due sometime at the end of the semester, basically sort of last day of classes, and that is a research assignment based on a number of questions. I'm not going to list them here. They are in the syllabus, and I'll explain them more in detail on the video. And if you have a better idea, if there's something that you're more interested in, I'm open to that, but that'll require actually sort of having a discussion with me. So, and that's it. The reflections, 2 writing assignments, and we're going to sort of watch the videos and so on. So that's it. Every reading has a video, and you're going to notice that they're somewhat like anonymous because I don't really mention Folk 2407 food and culture. a whole bunch of folklorists around North America. What we're trying to do is, because we're all in the same boat, and so many of us are teaching in asynchronous ways, we're making these videos. We're making these things that I can potentially take someone else's video, bring it into a class. Someone can take these and bring it into their classes. And so it's like, oh, does anyone have like an explainer on Adler's making pancakes on Sunday? They can find mine and they can shunt it into their class. And then there's going to have this sort of nice, large repertoire of these. And I mean, they're idiosyncratic in as much as they're my interpretations of them, but they might be useful. But that means that the videos are not necessarily going to expect that you have read the readings that exist prior to it, or are they going to sort of reference, as you will be finding out when we read blah, 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 with the exception of the videos for Diane Ties, because I'm going to break that up into probably 4 videos in total, as opposed to try and do one massive one for an entire book. But anyway, that's the exception. Otherwise, they are sort of, they exist sort of in solo. So you might come across a certain amount of repetition from video to video. Just remember that for someone else, that might be the only food and culture video that they are watching. So that's it. But anyway, that's why I also have the explainer videos that are much more this course specific. Read, watch the videos, do the reflections. And then there's one more thing. And this is optional because some of you are in different countries. Some of you are working, and this particular time to meet isn't good, which is one of the reasons why we're doing it asynchronously anyway. But starting on the, I guess technically the second week of classes, because I'm not going to spring this on you on day one. So what would that be, the 13th? Yeah, on January 13th at 1 o'clock, there will be, at 1 o'clock Atlantic time, there will be a Zoom link that you can go to, and you can hang out, and we'll be basing on the readings of this particular time. If you've read ahead, that's okay, but bear in mind that not everyone in the room might necessarily have read ahead. And we can just sort of hang out, discuss. It's not going to be me lecturing for an hour, because that's what the videos are for. But it's going to be sort of this opportunity for conversation. Hopefully you guys are talking as much as I am talking. And I will record the sound, and I'm going to put them up on Moodle when they're done. So if you can't make it, that's fine. What I do ask is that if this is something that you like, try and make an effort to be there. Or if you can't, if the reason you're not there is because of scheduling, try and encourage your other students, the other students in the class, to be there. Because it's time consuming. It's a positive thing, but it really only works with the more people who show up. An hour of me monologuing is not going to cut it. So if interest in this wanes, okay, I'll just stop doing it, because clearly people aren't that interested in attending. And it's because it's a technical thing, it's a time-consuming thing, it's a scheduling thing. And when I originally started these, back in September, I started these classes, and like students said, no, but we really want to meet. I'm like, okay, we'll do this then. And so I'm committing to do it. But if we want to meet and then you don't show up, then it's a lot of extra work for what I don't think is unnecessary. It's a lot of extra work that becomes unnecessary if no one's actually taking advantage of it. So that's it. But they are optional. I've been debating whether to introduce an incentive, like an attendance incentive, but I think that might actually disadvantage the people who can't make it, not because they don't want to, but because their schedules doesn't allow it. So that's it. Anyway, I don't really have anything else to say. I just decided I'm going to make this one more or less spontaneously. And I will, I hope you have a good semester. I'm available. All my contact information is on the syllabus. It's also on the Moodle page, or at least available through the Moodle page. You can message me through Moodle. And I think I don't have anything else to say right now. So, my friends, I wish you well. I hope this again. I hope you're okay. I hope 2021 is better than 2020. And I hope you have a good time, because this is the lecture where it's all based on basic concepts, and then it's all me telling you things that you have to do. So that's not necessarily fun. But yeah, we're done. I wish you well. Take care.